Imagine being
What
sent
is
across the
this?
world,
I need to
not
figure
for a
this out.
famous battle,
Aha!
not for a victory parade, but for a
These routes
mission
connect
that
key global
almost no
hubs.
one remembers.
From here, networks
Thousands
extend
of
across
American
oceans.
soldiers
This completes
deployed.
the strategic
They
overview.
trained. They fought. They followed orders. Yet decades later, their story almost disappeared from history. No movies. Few books. Barely a mention in classrooms. So the question is simple. Who were the soldiers America sent, and why were they forgotten? Tonight, we uncover the hidden chapter of U.S. military history that quietly shaped American warfare. But before we begin, if you enjoy deep stories about American military history, leave a like. It helps this channel bring more untold war stories to light. Now let's start where this story really begins. It begins in a place that looks completely ordinary. A recruitment office, fluorescent lights, a quiet desk, a young man signing his name on a line that feels routine. Outside, traffic moves. People walk past the window. No one notices that a decision has just been made. The paper slides across the desk. A handshake follows. Another American soldier joins the ranks. For many of them, the expectation was simple. Serve the country. Do the job. Come home. Maybe deploy somewhere familiar. Maybe to a war the nation was already watching. But that is not what happened. Instead, many of these soldiers were sent somewhere most Americans had never heard of. No massive headlines. No dramatic speeches on television. No constant updates on the evening news. Just quiet orders. Deployment orders. A location printed on paper that raised more questions than answers. Where exactly are we going? Why there? For some families, the map had to come out of a drawer. They would trace a finger across oceans, across unfamiliar regions, trying to understand where their son or daughter was about to go. And even then, the explanation was vague. Officially, the mission sounded simple. Advisory roles, support operations, strategic presence, words that sounded controlled, carefully measured. But the soldiers boarding those transport planes understood something else. When the military sends you across the world, there's always more to the story. The journey itself felt long. Hours in the air, the quiet hum of engines, rows of uniforms sitting shoulder to shoulder. Some soldiers slept. Others stared out the small oval windows. Below them, entire continents passed in silence. And slowly, the distance from home became very real. When they finally landed, the first thing many noticed was the heat. Heavy air, thick humidity, a landscape completely different from the one they had left behind. The terrain felt unfamiliar. The roads looked different. The language sounded unfamiliar. Even the smell of the air carried something new. For many of these soldiers, it was the first moment they realized just how far they had traveled. But the real surprise came during the first briefings. Inside small command rooms, maps covered the walls. Officers pointed to regions most of the soldiers had never studied before. Villages, rivers, mountain passes. Every detail suddenly mattered. The mission was explained carefully. They were there to stabilize the region, to support allies, to prevent something larger from unfolding. It sounded strategic, necessary, but there was something unusual about the way the mission was discussed. It wasn't framed as a major war. It wasn't presented as a historic campaign. Instead, it was described as something smaller, contained, temporary, the kind of operation that would quietly achieve its goal and then disappear from the headlines. And at first, many soldiers believed exactly that. They trained. They prepared equipment. They learned the terrain. Day by day, routines began to form. Morning briefings, equipment checks, patrol assignments. It looked like the beginning of any other overseas deployment. But something about the situation felt different. The media presence was almost non-existent. There were no reporters embedded nearby. No camera crews waiting for dramatic footage. Back home, most Americans barely knew this mission existed. Families received short updates, letters, occasional phone calls, simple messages meant to reassure. Everything is fine. We're doing our job. We'll be home soon. But on the ground, the soldiers were starting to notice something else. The mission was not as small as it had sounded. The terrain was more difficult, the situation more complicated, and the enemy was far harder to understand. Because what these soldiers had stepped into was not a quiet advisory mission. It was the early stage of something much larger, a conflict still unfolding, a war that had not yet fully revealed itself. And for the soldiers standing there, thousands of miles from home, the real story was only just beginning. The first patrol looked routine. Early morning light, boots hitting the dirt road, radios humming softly in the background. The soldiers moved in formation, just like they had trained, eyes scanning rooftops, watching the tree lines, listening for anything unusual. At first, nothing seemed out of place. A few civilians walking along the road, small shops opening their doors, the quiet rhythm of a place waking up for the day. But something about the atmosphere felt different. Not loud, not chaotic, just tense. The kind of tension you can't quite explain. It was in the way people looked at the patrol. Quick glances, doors closing quietly, conversations stopping when the soldiers passed by. For many of the Americans, it was the first signal that this mission was not going to be as predictable as the briefings had suggested. Back at the base, the reports started to grow. Small incidents, unclear encounters, strange movements spotted at night. Nothing large enough to make the news, but enough to make commanders start paying closer attention. Because the enemy here didn't operate the way American soldiers expected. There were no clear front lines, no obvious battlefield, no massive formations moving across open terrain. Instead, the conflict existed in fragments. A shadow moving behind a tree line. Footsteps heard in the distance. A radio signal that suddenly went silent. It created a strange kind of war. One where soldiers had to stay alert every minute of the day. Patrols became longer. Routes changed constantly. Every hill, every road, every village could hold something unexpected. And slowly, the realization began to settle in. This wasn't just a quiet support mission. It was something far more complex. But back in the United States, the story barely existed. Evening news broadcasts focused on other events, major political debates, economic stories, other conflicts that captured public attention. For the average American watching television at home, this mission was almost invisible. The soldiers knew it. Letters from home rarely mentioned the place they were deployed to. Friends asked general questions. Where are you stationed? Is everything calm over there? It was difficult to explain, because the war they were experiencing didn't look like the wars most Americans imagined. There were no famous battles, no widely known turning points, just long days filled with uncertainty, and nights that felt even longer. Inside the base, the routines continued. Equipment cleaned, vehicles repaired, maps constantly updated. The soldiers learned to read the environment carefully. Which roads felt safe, which areas demanded extra caution. Even the smallest detail could matter. A window that was open yesterday, but closed today. A road that suddenly looked empty. A village that grew unusually quiet when patrols arrived. Each observation added another piece to the puzzle. But the full picture remained unclear, and that uncertainty changed the way the soldiers thought about the mission. They began asking quiet questions. How long will we be here? What exactly are we trying to achieve? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, does anyone back home even know this is happening? Weeks turned into months. The patrols continued. The tension remained. And still, the mission rarely appeared in the headlines. To the outside world, it was a small deployment in a distant place. But for the soldiers walking those dusty roads every day, it felt very real. Because slowly, almost quietly, the situation was evolving. The conflict was growing more dangerous. The stakes were becoming clearer. And the soldiers who had arrived expecting a short assignment were beginning to understand something unsettling. They had stepped into a war that very few Americans were watching. And when wars unfold without attention, something else often happens. They can disappear from memory almost as quickly as they begin. But what none of those soldiers knew yet was that the silence surrounding their mission would follow them long after the deployment ended. The day the mission ended did not look the way many soldiers imagined. There were no large ceremonies, no crowds waiting with flags, no television cameras lining the runway, just another transport plane on the tarmac, engines running, cargo doors open, soldiers loading their gear for the trip home. For months, sometimes longer, this place had defined their daily lives. The heat, the patrol routes, the constant awareness of their surroundings. Now suddenly it was over. Orders had arrived. Units were rotating out. Equipment was being packed. And one by one, the soldiers climbed the steps into the aircraft. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt strangely quiet. Some soldiers leaned back and closed their eyes. Others looked down at the floor, still processing the moment. For a long time, the mission had felt endless. Patrol after patrol, briefing after briefing, days blending into each other. But now the engines roared to life. The plane lifted off, and the landscape below slowly disappeared beneath the clouds. For many of the soldiers, that moment carried a simple expectation. When they returned home, people would want to hear the story. Friends would ask questions. Families would want to understand what it had been like. After all, they had served overseas. They had spent months in a place most Americans had never seen. Surely someone would want to know. But when the plane finally landed back in the United States, something felt different. The airport looked normal. Travelers moving quickly through the terminal. Announcements echoing through the building. Life continuing exactly as it had before. The soldiers stepped off the aircraft carrying duffel bags and backpacks. A few family members waited nearby. Some hugs, some quiet smiles. But beyond that small circle, the world seemed almost unaware that they had returned. There were no news cameras waiting, no reporters asking questions, no major headlines describing the mission they had just completed. In fact, many Americans had never even heard of the place they had been deployed to. At first, it didn't seem important. Most soldiers were simply happy to be home. They reunited with families, returned to familiar streets, sat in living rooms that suddenly felt peaceful and quiet. But slowly, over the following weeks and months, something unusual began to surface. When people asked about their deployment, the conversations often ended quickly. "So where were you stationed?" The soldier would answer, and then came the pause, a moment of confusion. Sometimes the response was simple. "Oh, I've never heard of that." Other times the subject would shift almost immediately. Another war dominated the headlines. Another conflict filled television screens. Another chapter of history captured the public's attention. And just like that, the mission these soldiers had served in began to fade into the background. Not because it wasn't important, not because it hadn't been difficult, but because history often moves quickly. New events replace old ones. New wars replace quieter conflicts. And public attention follows wherever the spotlight moves. Inside military circles, the mission was remembered. Reports were written. Lessons were studied. Maps and documents were filed away in archives. But outside those circles, the story grew quieter. Years passed. The soldiers continued their lives. Some stayed in the military. Others returned to civilian careers. Families grew. Communities changed. And gradually, the deployment became something mentioned only in small conversations. A story shared between veterans. A memory brought up during reunions, but rarely discussed beyond those rooms. For the American public, the mission had almost disappeared. No famous movies were made about it. Few documentaries explored it. Even history books sometimes mentioned it only briefly. Just a paragraph, a footnote, a small line in a long timeline of American military history. And yet, for the soldiers who had served there, the memories remained vivid. They remembered the roads they had patrolled, the heat of the afternoons, the long nights listening to distant sounds in unfamiliar terrain. Those experiences did not vanish, even if the broader story slowly slipped out of public awareness. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. Sometimes decades later, researchers begin revisiting old records. Historians start asking new questions, and forgotten missions quietly return to the conversation. Because when they looked more closely at this particular deployment, they began to realize something important. The soldiers America had sent there were part of a story much bigger than anyone had understood at the time. A story that had shaped military strategy, influenced future conflicts, and left behind lessons that the world would only recognize years later. But by then, most Americans had already forgotten where those soldiers had been. Years later, the story begins to return in quiet ways. Not on television at first, not in major headlines, but in small places. A university archive, A historian's research notes, boxes of military reports that had been sitting on shelves for decades. Inside those documents were details that most Americans had never seen. Maps marked with patrol routes, operational summaries, handwritten notes from officers trying to understand a complicated situation far from home. Piece by piece, researchers began to reconstruct the mission. What they found surprised many of them, because the deployment that had once seemed small was never truly small at all. It had been an early test, a moment where American soldiers encountered a type of conflict that would shape military thinking for years to come. A war without clear front lines, an enemy that moved quietly through the environment, operations that depended less on massive battles and more on patience, awareness, and constant adaptation. At the time, few people outside the military paid attention to these lessons, but inside strategy rooms and training centers, they mattered. Commanders studied what had happened. Analysts examined every report. Training manuals slowly began to evolve. Future deployments would carry the influence of what those soldiers had experienced. And yet, even as the lessons spread quietly through the military, the names of the soldiers themselves remained largely unknown to the public. There were no famous monuments dedicated to that specific mission, no widely known anniversaries, no annual television specials remembering the deployment. The soldiers had simply done their duty, and then history had moved forward. But for the veterans themselves, the memories never completely faded. Years later, they would sometimes meet again, at small reunions, in community halls, at veterans gatherings where stories resurfaced after long stretches of silence. Someone would mention a patrol route, another would remember a particular village, a third might recall a moment when everything suddenly became tense and uncertain. The details returned easily, because for those who were there, the mission had never truly disappeared. It had simply become something the rest of the country rarely talked about. And perhaps that is one of the quieter realities of military service. Not every deployment becomes a famous chapter in history. Some remain in the background, overshadowed by larger wars, forgotten by the pace of national attention. But that does not make them unimportant. Every mission shapes the people who serve in it. Every experience adds something to the long story of a nation's military. And sometimes, the most influential moments are the ones that unfold far away from cameras and headlines. The soldiers who served in this mission carried that experience with them for the rest of their lives. They returned home, built families, worked ordinary jobs, lived in neighborhoods where most people had no idea where they had once been deployed. If you passed them in a grocery store, or sat near them in a cafe, you might never know that they had once stood thousands of miles away, representing their country in a mission that history nearly overlooked. But their service was real. Their presence mattered, and the lessons from that deployment quietly influenced the generations of soldiers who followed. Today, historians continue uncovering more pieces of that story. Old reports are reread. Interviews with veterans are recorded. Archives slowly reveal the full picture. And as those pieces come together, the mission no longer looks like a forgotten footnote. It looks like a chapter that simply waited a long time to be understood. The soldiers America sent there may not appear in many headlines. Their deployment may never become the subject of blockbuster films. But their role remains part of the larger story of American service. A story built not only on famous battles and well-known victories, but also on the quiet missions carried out by men and women who followed orders, did their job, and came home, even if most of the country never realized where they had been. And sometimes, history doesn't forget those stories forever. Sometimes it just takes time for people to start listening again.